Good evening. So the election is tomorrow, and tonight we're meeting to discuss the latest polls and predictions, and we'll try to summarize the election campaign so far. And my guest today is Asher Fredman from the Kohelet Policy Forum, who will help me to understand what's going on. We'll together try to understand the latest developments, and we will see. Maybe we will already know who is going to win. Hello, Asher, and thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So I just put here on the screen what I just took from Ynet website. And it's the average of the latest TV poll results. It's in Hebrew, but I will translate what it says. Basically, according to this average, at the moment, the largest electoral list is going to be Likud, 32 seats. The next is the main party in the government now, Yesh Atid, which is the party of Yair Lapid, is 24 seats. And in general, if you look at the division between blocks, it's 60-60. 60 for the right wing and 60 for the left wing. Okay, so, but I would like to ask Asher now, what information do you have about the latest opinion polls, and what expects us tomorrow, if any?
So as I'm sure, as what's important to understand is that the Israeli election system is a nationwide proportionate election system, right? So a party that gets 25% of the vote will get 25% of the seats in the Knesset, in Israel's parliament. Now, that's true, except for one very important factor, and that is the electoral threshold. So a party gets its proportionate number of seats in the Knesset, which is 120 seats, which is why you need 61 for a coalition, but it must get above 3.25% of the overall national vote to even enter the Knesset. And what happens is, even if a party gets, let's say, 3% of the nationwide vote, essentially all of those votes are discounted. Now, what's interesting is if you look at that list that you just had on the screen, there are 4 parties that are generally associated with the left or the anti-Netanyahu camp that are all sort of hovering around the electoral threshold. 4 seats is the minimum amount of seats, and so you see there are 4 parties there with 5, 5, 4, and 4. There are also 2 additional parties, Ayelet Shakid's Bayit Yehudi party on the right and the Balad Arab party on the left, or on the anti-Netanyahu camp, that are also a big question mark whether or not they will cross the threshold. So even though, as you mentioned, according to the polls, we've seen very little change across this entire campaign. We've seen more or less 60-60, occasionally 59-61. One big question will be which of these parties will or will not cross the threshold, and that could lead to significant change in the outcome.
Okay, so just to translate what we have there on the bottom of the list are 2 Arab parties, which each of them is projected 4 seats. So because of the threshold, you can't really have a list of 3 seats in the parliament. So this is Ram, which is a part of the current coalition, and Hadash Tal, which is Arab Communist Party and many other groups, which also is projected with 4 seats. So if one of them doesn't cross this threshold, then it's kind of a blow for the anti-Netanyahu camp. And then there are 2 lists with slightly more support. It's Meretz and Labour, and they both belong to the ideological Jewish left wing. So these are the lists are more at risk, but because like slight fluctuation in the voter turnout may influence the results. So we can't really project, I think, if all of these parties actually cross the threshold, or if any of them loses. Am I correct in what I described now?
Absolutely. And recall that we've had some surprises. If you'll recall, in one of the previous election rounds, Moshe Feiglin's party was projected in the polls right before the elections to take 6 seats. In the end, they failed to cross the threshold. We've seen the Blue and White Party was expected to have significantly fewer seats than it did, and there was some momentum towards the end of the campaign, and they increased the number of seats. So there are surprises at the end. It'll be very, very close one way or another. So if we're 60-60, then we're likely stuck and we may be going to another elections. If we're 61-59, which again is a very small difference in terms of voting outcome, then we may have a stable government for a number of years. So really, it is very, very difficult to predict at this point.
Okay, let's imagine that there will be really 60-60 result. Do you think there is any possibility that there will be cross bloc coalition or kind of national unity coalition? Some right-wing and left-wing parties coming together, or the depths of mutual distrust is so big that it's actually impossible?
I'm reminded of a saying I once heard that in politics, there are no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, just permanent interests. I do think that there is, first of all, if we thought that the election campaign was full of drama and intrigue, if we indeed are instead of 60-60, we're going to have probably several months of backroom deals, intrigue, offers, counter offers, as each side tries indeed to bring members of the opposite camp to support its candidate for prime minister, because anybody will need at least 61 votes. I do think it's possible. I think that each party is going to be looking at its interests, its constituencies, the implications of its spending additional time in the opposition, whether its starting position in the next elections will be better or worse off. So I do think we might see some surprises in the negotiations following the election.
Okay, let's look at the moment at the third list on the top, which is religious Zionism, and it's projected with 13 seats. And it's this list is a block of basically two parties. One is headed by Bezalel Smotrich. It's a kind of Orthodox national settler-oriented political movement, and the other is headed by Itamar Ben-Gvir. Usually, this part of the electorate is relatively small. Usually, we would expect from this party of this bloc to get 5 or 6 seats in the Knesset. Now there is according to the polls, there is a surge for this list, and in this respect, I have 2 questions. Basically, does this popularity in the polls of this list will reflect the results? So will they do think, just our estimation, if that this list will receive 13 seats? And the other question, provided that they do so well, and provided that there is a right-wing majority, what does it mean for the future coalition? Because many on the moderate right are not really happy about the possible influence of this list, and especially of Itamar Ben-Gvir. Will their success increase the chances of formation of right-wing government, or will it push Netanyahu towards trying to form a national unity, a kind of national unity government, for example, with Gantz?
Those are all very important questions. I think that we may see this list, the national religious list, reach even more, potentially 14, 15 seats. I think is certainly a possibility. My analysis is that Netanyahu would be quite satisfied to establish a party together with them and with the ultra-Orthodox Haredi parties. I think that we have to look at where such a party could have influence and where its influence is less likely to be felt. In general, I think that such a party's influence would likely be on largely internal domestic matters. For example, reforms related to Israel's judicial system and the balance of powers between the judiciary and the Knesset, the parliament, and government, and the ministers and the executive branch. I think there we may see some change if they are indeed a senior member of the coalition. On larger international issues, I think it would still very much be Netanyahu and the Likud steering the ship of state.
Okay. And now let's imagine that the anti-Netanyahu bloc has a majority of 61 and more. Previously, in the current Knesset, this bloc had a majority, but the Arab party, Hadash, was not prepared to become full member of the coalition, and that's why we have now this election. Do you think that if this bloc has 61 seats and more, there will be a full left-wing coalition which will include all Arab parties, or you think it's quite unlikely?
I think we saw in the previous government a very interesting split between the Arab party known as Ram and then the Arab party known as the Joint List, which was made up 2/3 of it of Hadash Tal, where Rams decided that it wanted to play a role in the government, that by playing an act or in the coalition, by being a member of the coalition, it could advance its agenda, it could improve it could advance the interests of its constituencies, the welfare of the people who it represents, whereas the Joint List is more has taken positions that are quite anti-Zionist, that in some ways are in ideological opposition to some of the core tenets of the state. And I think that we've seen that trend continue with Hadash Tal. So we've seen, for example, one of the lawmakers several of the lawmakers from the party praising terrorists or speaking positively about terrorists and excusing terror attacks. And I think a party like that, which really is opposed to some of the really core tenets of the Jewish and democratic state of Israel, I think would find it very difficult to participate in any kind of government coalition. Personally, I hope that the trend that we've been seeing, whether it's Ram or some other party, but the trend of positive participation from the Arab citizens of Israel in a constructive way will be a trend that will increase.
Okay, so basically, what I take from you now, that what follows from the words is that there are two realistic possibilities: either right-wing government or the coalition with predominantly right-wing parties, or a kind of situation in which no government is formed, the current transitional government continues, and the new election is called. So you don't really see any not big chance of having a left-wing coalition with the support of our parties.
I think you are correct. I think we will either see a narrow right-wing government, or we will see a political quagmire that will likely lead to another round of elections, unfortunately.
But there is also another scenario, at least some people in the current coalition hope that would materialize in the last Knesset, which means that there will be left of center coalition, which will incorporate some parties or some politicians from right wing by splitting them. So they hoped, for example, in this Knesset, maybe they can convince ultra-Orthodox parties or maybe some members of Likud split from Netanyahu. This they didn't succeed in it, and actually Netanyahu was able to keep his bloc intact. Do you think that if there is such a situation, there is a slight majority to left-wing anti-Netanyahu bloc, but the Arab party, at least Hadash, doesn't join the government, there would be a possibility that this time they will succeed and maybe they will forge some deal with religious parties or with some split faction of Likud?
I think that the lesson that many took, I think the current government, which we know was made of 8 parties from a very broad spectrum, was actually very interesting in many ways. But I think the lesson that many of the lawmakers took from it was that such a broad, really, super diverse coalition is very fragile. And it seems to me that even if it were possible to, let's say, bring together part of the ultra-Orthodox parties and the left-wing Meretz party for a short amount of time, there would be a good deal of reluctance to do that because the most recent experience showed that such a government would be short-lived in any case. Now, what will be in the Likud is an interesting question. There are certainly Likud members of Knesset that see themselves as future potential candidates for a prime minister. Benjamin Netanyahu has shown remarkable dominance and leadership of the Likud party over the last long period. And another interesting question will be, will there be up-and-coming Likud lawmakers who will take a more proactive stance in challenging Benjamin Netanyahu for the leadership of the Likud? Of course, now across the board, they've all said they will not. Whether or not they will, and when they face the prospect of another set of elections, in politics, anything can happen.
Okay, and another scenario. I just try to make your life more difficult, so I invent all kind of possible plots. So imagine there is a right-wing win, and Netanyahu decides to form a narrow right-wing coalition, and then the Supreme Court comes and says, although the law allows the prime minister under indictment, the prime minister under the trial to serve in office, we actually interpreted that he can't be appointed. He can't be allowed to form a government. How realistic is this possibility that Netanyahu won't be able to form the government even though he wins the election?
I think that would be a terrible outcome and a terrible mistake if the law is clear, allowing somebody in Netanyahu's legal situation to run and lead the government. And if he gets a majority from the people, then I think it's clear that he should be allowed to form the government. It's absolutely true that the Israeli High Court has taken a very activist, far-reaching, some would say, far-reaching in terms of their involvement in the Israeli political system. In that sense, I wouldn't say that it is inconceivable that they would actually take a stance like that and adopt some very broad interpretation of basic laws or of their own constitutional principles. I think that would also be a blow to the stature of the court. Again, because the law is clear that Netanyahu can form and lead a government without going into the whole complex ethical, political, legal discussion. I would imagine that the court would think twice about going so far in its judicial activism, but it would not be impossible by any stretch of the imagination.
Okay. And then the last question. There is one person about whom I didn't speak in the course of my streams, but I think it's at some point it may turn to be quite important, who is the president of the state of Israel, and currently it's Herzog, and he's a relatively young person. And it's quite likely that after he serves his term, he will try to return to politics and maybe become prime minister at some point. And generally, president is a ceremonial office in Israel, but the president has some discretion in deciding about appointing someone to form the government if the result is unclear. How do you think that some presidents in Israel took a kind of back seat in such situations, and some other presidents were very active? For example, Yitzhak Herzog's father, who was actually very instrumental in forging National Unity Coalition in 1984 when he was president. What do you expect from a current President Herzog? Will he actually intervene in the political process to navigate the formation of coalition, perhaps a broader coalition than a narrow right-wing coalition?
I think that is a very interesting point. And although President Herzog is young, he enjoys a widespread popularity really across the political spectrum. I mean, he was elected with the Knesset elects the president, and he was elected with more votes than any other president in the history of Israel. And he's also quite a political savvy person. And although he was the leader of the Labor Party, he maintained strong ties again across the political spectrum.
Yeah, and he's actually highly respected among many right-wing people in Israel. That's interesting that he succeeded actually to forge such a consensus around him.
Absolutely. It's absolutely true. And I think that, I would put it this way, I think that if there's anybody who has the stature and the relationships to encourage a wider national unity government, it would be President Herzog. But I think the reality is that the divide between the pro-Netanyahu and anti-Netanyahu camp is so deep that even President Herzog would not be able to bring the sides together. And that's just the reality.
Okay, got it. Okay, Asher, thank you very much. It was very interesting. It was a pleasure to talk with you. And thank you for agreeing to join me.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, have a good evening.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Okay, so we're now about to finish this stream. Tomorrow, the election. Those of you who are citizens of Israel and reside in Israel, camp and vote. And tomorrow evening, we'll meet again to discuss the exit polls. Good evening.